Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the National Center on Caregiving's webinar, NASW Standards for Social Work Practice with Family Caregivers of Older Adults with Dr. Sandra Crew. I'm Edwina Harrison, the Information Program Specialist with the Family Caregiver Alliance and the National Center on Caregiving here in San Francisco. Family Caregiver Alliance has worked for over 30 years to improve the quality of life for family caregivers through direct services, research, public awareness, and advocacy. With our colleagues at AARP National Respite Network and Resource Center, we jointly operate the Technical Assistance Centers for Caregiver Programs and Lifespan Respite. We do this to support the aging and respite networks to better serve older adults and their caregivers. The centers provide access to practical tools and multimedia and maintain 2 websites with national databases of respite and model caregiver support programs and materials. We write policy updates, sponsor specialized trainings, and provide individualized technical support. The Technical Assistance Centers are funded by the U.S. Administration on Aging. Today's webinar is part of our Aging Network Staff Development Series. The first webinar we held was called Caregiving 101, Exploring the Complexities of Family Caregiving, and it's now archived on the Family Caregiver Alliance website. That website is www.caregiver.org. This series follows the knowledge and competency recommendations from a symposium of leaders in social work and nursing called the Professional Partners Supporting Family Caregivers, and the symposium was funded by the John A. Hartford Foundation. Today's session about the recent NASW standards continues a much larger discussion about effective practice with family caregivers. Before we introduce our speaker, Dr. Crew, who was actually on the expert panel which developed the standards, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping tasks. On the left side of your screen, you'll be able to see the slides as they're being presented. On the right side is the control panel. You can use the orange arrow at the top to manage the control panel. Due to the high number of attendees today, and we are really pleased that so many of you decided to join us. During the presentation, each one of you will be placed on mute. We ask that you type in any questions or comments in the section on your screen and then hit send. After the presentation, there will be a question and answer period. If your particular question is not answered today, please be assured that we'll follow up with responses to those questions after the presentation and have them available on the Family Caregiver Alliance website. Again, that website is www.caregiver.org, along with the archived webinar from today. At this point, I'd like to turn the session over to Greg Link, who is the Aging Services Program Specialist from the U.S. Administration on Aging, for his remarks. Greg?
Hi, thank you, Adrina, and thank you for everyone for tuning into this webinar. I'm with the Administration on Aging, and we've had the good opportunity to be able to fund the Family Caregiver Alliance to assist us as we continue to build the capacity of the Aging Network to meet the needs of family caregivers and supporting the educational needs of those who work with and on behalf of family caregivers around the country is certainly one of Assistant Secretary Greenlee's main objectives. So in the interest of time, I just want to say thank you to the Caregiver Alliance for pulling this webinar together, and I look forward to the information that's provided. Adrina?
Thank you, Greg. I'd like to give a little background before we do the formal introduction to our speaker. As many of us already know, the aging of our population presents many social, economic, and political implications for families, professions, and the global community. In 2010, NASW, in partnership with AARP, the Administration on Aging, Family Caregiver Alliance, and with funding from the John A. Hartford Foundation, issued the NASW Standards for social work practice with family caregivers of older adults. These 12 standards were developed to help increase awareness about the skills, knowledge, values, methods, and sensitivity that are really needed to work effectively with family caregivers as a group. Dr. Sandra Crew is a professor. She's also the Associate Dean for Academic and Student Advancement. She's the Director of the Multidisciplinary Center for Gerontology at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She received her MSW from Catholic University and her PhD from Howard University. She's a member of the Academy of Certified Social Workers, and she completed her management leadership studies at Harvard University. Her particular areas of practice and research expertise include program evaluation, professional development, capacity building and leadership, caregiving, ethnogerontology, African American women, and qualitative research. Dr. Crew has over 20 years of experience in the field, and she has numerous community and professional memberships, including the Council on Social Work Education's Council of Professional Development and the NASW's Aging Specialty section. Dr. Crew is the co-director of the Washington Area Geriatric Education Center Consortium, and she's also a Master Faculty Scholar. She serves as the Program Evaluation Consultant for the Department of Social Development in Cape Town, South Africa. During her tenure at Howard University, she's received many awards and honors for scholarship, public service, and teaching, in addition to being named Social Worker of the Year. Dr. Crew has made numerous professional presentations and has served as co-editor of professional journals. And she's also the co-author of the book, Kinship Care, From Family Tradition to Social Policy in the African American Community. We are indeed very honored and excited to have Dr. Crew with us today. And if you'll bear with us for perhaps about 2 minutes, she'll be able to connect with us and begin the presentation. And we do apologize for the slight delay. Hello, Dr. Crew?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for those of you who are with us and been very patient. As I mentioned before, we are indeed, very honored and even excited now, even more so, to have Dr. Crew with us today. Welcome, Dr. Crew.
Thank you so very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the kind introduction that I know that you made, and I do apologize for the technical difficulties. It is indeed a pleasure to be involved in this webinar. I would particularly like to thank the audience because I know this is a Friday afternoon in the month of July, and you are probably thinking about being on the beach or maybe finishing the debt ceiling discussion. So it is particularly important that you have taken the time out to be here today. Having standards for social work practice with caregivers of older adults is important to me, both professionally and personally. I am on the first slide. Just 2 days ago, my brother-in-law had to make a tough call to place his mother into a nursing home. He is struggling with the fact that he has to break a promise to his mother, a promise to always keep her at home and not in a nursing home. I reminded him that there were little promises and big promises. The little promises was that he would keep his mother in her home. The big promise, though, that he would take care of her and love her and give her quality of life. So in working with family caregiving, and it is so important that we as social workers be focused on the various aspects of that caregiving. As most of you know, the aging population is growing in leaps and bounds. With this growth phenomena comes challenges that often affect the entire family, who struggle to provide physical, emotional, financial, and practical support to their aging members. According to the Institute of Medicine, family members, friends, and other unpaid caregivers provide the backbone for much of the care that is received by older adults. Yet that role is unappreciated. As an African American woman, I have worked tirelessly all of my life not to become a statistic. I find myself now at the age of 60 a statistic. Today, how I am a statistic because I am one of those caregivers and sometimes I feel undervalued, marginalized as a caregiver. So these family caregiver standards are particularly important to me. Ms. Harrison, I'm only seeing the one screen. The Family Caregivers Alliance, I would like to thank you for this opportunity for being with you today. I prefer to do face-to-face presentations. However, I am delighted to be able to aid you using this technology despite the challenges that I have just experienced. Before I venture too far, I would like to explain that within the standards, family has a meaning. The term family and family caregiver refer to the family of origin, the extended family, domestic partners, friends, or other individuals who support an older individual. The collective of all is referred to as the family system. So as we venture into this dialogue, it is really very important that we understand the definition of caregiving, because caregiving is the foundation of these particular standards. When we think of caregiving, we're thinking about supports and services provided primarily on a voluntary basis, but not to professional contractual services, such as social work or home health aid services, but they are provided to with no fee to the public. What is included in family caregiving? What is included in family caregiving is the emotional, social, and spiritual support, assistance with decision-making related to health care, financial matters, and lifespan planning. Assistance with physical tasks is important in this whole process, the ADLs as well as the IADLs. Additionally, assistance with practical matters is really important as we begin to think about family caregiving. And reflecting upon this, I must say that I believe that I have done all of these things this week. So it is critically important that we have social work standards to help us to be better professionals as we work in the field of family caregiving. On slide, the presentation overview slide, it addresses the aspects of the presentation today, starting with the background, the standards, the case study presentation, the review of each of the standards, and I will also discuss briefly some of the case study story presentation that I wish to make. The aging of the population presents both opportunities and challenges for the social work profession and society. Although family caregivers play a critical role in supporting older adults, they frequently do so without the recognition they deserve or the support they need. Through discussion of standards and a presentation of a story, I will further discuss the standards that we have developed. Again, I wish to acknowledge the partners and expert panelists who were very much involved in these standards. I particularly would like to express appreciation to Chris Herman of the National Association of Social Work Staff for her input on this presentation. The slide on NASW provides the link that you can access using the computer. It is very important that you have an opportunity to look at these standards. If I were teaching class at Harvard University, I would have had the students review the standards first and then engage in a Q&A session so that I could definitely get a better understanding of what the questions are that arise related to the standards. The standards complement other national initiatives, and as stated, they were developed by a panel of They were shaped by a panel of 11 social workers. Additionally, there was a survey of gerontological social workers as well. The standards are not intended solely for social workers in the field of aging. Additionally, the standards can be useful to other disciplines, and I know that there are other disciplines on the phone today. So as we think about the standards, we must raise the question, why have family caregiver standards? Why was it important to have the standards? The standards are designed to enhance social workers' awareness of the skills, knowledge, values, methods, and sensitivity needed to work effectively with family caregivers. These standards are designed to enhance social work practice with family caregivers of older adults and to help the public understand the role of the professional social worker in supporting family caregivers. These standards can also inform practice with family caring for younger people, although they're designed for older people because they include the values of the profession of social work. They are useful across the board. So I have also found in using these standards that caregivers themselves have benefited from them. By reading the standards, they have a better sense of what they should be asking for professional assistance for. The standards articulate 6 goals. These 6 goals are: Goal 1, to inform social workers about family caregiver as an expanding field of social work knowledge. Goal 2 is to improve the quality of social work services provided to family caregivers of older adults. Goal 3 is to provide a basis for the development of continuing education materials and programs related to family caregiving. Goal 4 is to ensure that social work services to family caregivers of older adults are guided by the NASW Code of Ethics. The 5th goal is to advocate for family caregivers' right to self-determination, confidentiality, access to supportive services, and appropriate inclusion in decision-making affecting older adults. And the 6th goal, the final goal, is to encourage social workers to participate in the development and refinement of public policy at the local, state, and federal levels to support family caregivers of older adults. Now let's consider the following story as I think about the application of the standards. Mrs. Faith Hope is 92 years old and widowed for over 10 years. She is very spiritual and supports her church and tele-evangelism. She takes care of all of her ADLs and most of her IADLs. She does rely upon her son and niece to purchase groceries and run errands. She also relies upon a friend, 70 years age, who helps in running errands. She is a caregiver for a daughter who is 65 years old and disabled. The daughter is bedridden as a result of rheumatoid arthritis, and Mrs. Hope provides all of the ADLs. She cannot feed or toilet herself. Additionally, her daughter has experienced lifelong episodes of schizophrenia. Her daughter has not been treated by a medical or mental health provider in over 10 years. She is not currently on any medications. Sometimes the daughter is left unattended while Mrs. Hope runs errands to pay her bills. This poses a safety risk. Ms. Hope is becoming frail and no longer physically capable of caring for her daughter. Yet she does not want her to be placed in a nursing home. She is adamant about this. However, she is concerned that her daughter's money received from her Social Security disability check is being taken by visitors. The check is issued to her daughter in the daughter's name, and she has a relative to cash it. Mrs. Hope wants to get her daughter's check sent to her son, and she feels that he is very responsible. Mrs. Hope has 4 sons and 3 daughters-in-law. All are involved in the family caregiving system in one way or the other. They really feel that their mother is not capable of caring for their sister. But yet, Mrs. Hope, the family caregiver of the disabled daughter, is insisted upon doing it. Despite the mother's wishes, an acquaintance contacts the AAA agency and requests home care assistance. A social worker enters the picture at this time. These standards of practice can help the social worker work with Mrs. Hope as she navigates her role in working with her sons. This is what I refer to as a double-decker stacked family caregiving arrangement. The mother is a caregiver, but the mother is also receiving care. A 92-year-old is a caregiver, and the 92-year-old is also in need of care. There are multiple caregivers in this scenario. So in thinking about the 12 standards that are before you, we feel that it is important that social workers practice with family caregivers with certain structure. The 12 standards, as you can see, and you've been looking at them for a while, start off with ethics and values, and they end with professional development and competence. Regardless of the practice setting or the primary clientele, social workers who interface with older adults or family caregivers find themselves with a need to assist family caregivers to balance the needs and goals of both populations, and they must recognize that those needs and goals may sometimes result in conflict. Thinking about the case or the story about Mrs. Hope, you can see that there's beginning to be sibling conflict. 2 of the brothers want the mother to place the sister in an extended care facility. The other 2 feel that she should be able to take care of the daughter at home and would like some help to come in. It is really important that as we examine the standards, we begin to think about our role as social workers and how we can improve the quality of life of the caregiver as well as the care receiver. So I will now quickly go into each of the standards, starting with Standard 1, Ethics and Values. Standard 1 illustrates that the support for family caregivers is congruent with the social work profession's missions and values, making clear that there's the need to understand and adhere to both the NASW Code of Ethics and laws, regulations, and policies relevant to social work practice, aging, and family caregiving. The standard acknowledges ethical challenges that social workers face in responding to the differences of opinion among family members and in addressing situations of suspected abuse and neglect. The need for practitioner self-awareness and self-care is highlighted as critical to effective service delivery. When we're thinking about social work practice with caregivers, it is imperative that we enter these family domains through self-awareness and constant checking in on ourselves regarding self-care to ensure that the primacy is given to the family caregivers and that we have checked our personal values at the door. As you will see with all of these standards, they are very congruent with what we are expected to do as a social worker. So as we think about the mission of being rooted in a set of core values that constitutes the foundation of social work, this relates very closely to our social work values. And you can see the values listed: services, social justice, human dignity and worth, the importance of human relationship, integrity, and competence as well, as we go through this. So as we begin to think about the case story that I told you, Mrs. Hope's sons do not agree that their mother should be the primary caregiver. There's dialogue about there being possible financial exploitation. There's the problem of safety of the daughter. All of these require that we bring in our ethics and values to address the situation. Standard 2 addresses qualifications. Standard 2 outlines the 3 minimum qualifications for social work practice with family caregivers of older adults. The 3 minimum qualifications are: 1, a social work degree from a Council of Social Work Education accredited school or program. The second is adherence to the state laws and regulations governing social work licensure and certification. And the third is professional background and experience in aging and family caregiving. I move now to Standard 3, which is knowledge. Standard 3 expands upon the requisite knowledge needed for effective practice with family caregivers of older adults. Such knowledge includes an understanding of aging, health, including behavioral, mental, and physical health, family caregiving experiences, resources, and the role of the professional social worker. As we begin to think about family caregiving experiences, I'd like to highlight a few points. Family systems, interpersonal dynamics, and the complexity of caregiving relationship must remain central to this conversation. We must be concerned as social workers about the interdependence in care partnerships. What is the relationship and the family dynamics that exists within a household that we enter? We must be very concerned about the family caregiver's central role in the healthcare delivery. Again, we must pay attention to signs of caregiver stress, and there must be attention to re-engagement and healing after death of care of recipients. So as we begin to think about the knowledge that is needed, it is important that we not assume that this is a single dimension. We must look at family caregiving with the multiple dimensions that includes the complexity of aging in a particular cultural context, the physical health, as I've said, the mental and behavioral health, family caregiving experiences, resources, and the professional role of the social worker. As in the story with Ms. Hope, each system has members that contribute to the well-being and the stress of the family caregiver. So the social worker must be very much in tune with understanding that family caregiving is a source of joy and it's also a source of stress. So it insists that we have knowledge of both current theory, practice, the socio-historical context, the policy, evidence-based research, and the evaluation methods used in related to aging and family caregiving. I now move to Standard 4. Standard 4 describes the need for cultural and linguistic competence. As outlined in the NASW's indicators for the achievement of NASW standards for cultural competence in social work practice, there is a need for us to be culturally and linguistically competent here. I have mentioned these standards before, but the National Association of Social Workers has a number of standards that really do complement the particular standards that we're talking about today. So, consistent with NASW standards, culture is broadly defined, encouraging practitioners to regard each communication as a cross-cultural interaction. Furthermore, the standards remind social workers that cultural competence is rooted in each social worker's cultural awareness and emphasizes culture as a source of resilience for individuals and families. The influence of culture on organizational and societal structures and functions is also addressed in the standards. So as we begin to think about the standards, cultural competence begins with each social worker's cultural self-identification. It is really important that we address cultural self-identification because without that, we're likely to enter the family caregiving situation with our culture influencing our delivery of services to the family caregiver. So thus it becomes very important that social workers recognize and affirm that cultural and linguistic diversity are critical both to the formation of therapeutic alliances with family caregivers and to cooperative working relationships. That diversity includes, and I emphasize this, the diversity includes but is not limited to race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, biological, sex, gender, identity, sexual orientation, religion, age, health, status, preferred language, migration background, documentation status, the degree of acculturation, and literacy. I have taken the time to mention all of these because sometimes we stop short of looking at the full range of diversity. We will think about a diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, but the other diverse situations are equally important. Simply stated, there is diversity within the diversity, but we also must be cognizant of there is diversity among families, but also within the family system. As I discussed the case story of Mrs. Hope, many of her family members who are involved in the family caregiving system have different belief systems as it relates to faith and spirituality. Thus, we must always be aware that there are differences within families, although they may appear to be within the same cultural group. So as we begin to think about cultural and linguistic competence, we must use those social work skills of assessment as we move forward in thinking about this. I am now moving to Standard 5. And again, I do hope you have had an opportunity to print out the standards so that you can begin to understand the comprehensive nature of what has been prepared as it relates to social work standards for practice with older adults. Standard 5, as I've spoken about, addresses assessment. Standard 5 links ongoing biopsychosocial assessment with other aspects of practice and underscores the collaborative role of family caregivers. It is basically a standard that details the multiple aspects of the assessment process. It is grouped into 3 themes. 1, family characteristics and dynamics. The second theme is goals and effects of family caregiving. And the third one is risk assessment. Again, these should seem very familiar to social workers because assessment really is the groundwork that we must do to determine the best service to deliver to the family caregiver. When we begin to think about the short story I told of Mrs. Hope, it's important that we think of our assessment, including a strength-based assessment. We need to think about the strength that it takes for a 92-year-old to assume full caregiving responsibility for a 65-year-old daughter who's bedridden. We need to begin to think about the strong faith community that's surrounding her. Her goals may be different from her son's goals for her as the caregiver, but her interest is in her daughter. The son seemed more interested in their mother, but the mother is more interested in her daughter. So as we would do the assessment, we must really consider the risk to both parties. But again, these standards are aimed at the family caregiver. So it's particularly important that we pay attention to the risk that the families are facing, but also that it be client-centered. Being client-centered is critically important as we go through this discussion. Standard 6. We're about halfway through, so stay with me. Again, if I were in my class, if you were in a class, I'd start showing you some of my different props that I use to keep the class alert. So shake your hands and, stand up so that you can stay focused here. Standard 6, planning, delivery, and monitoring. Standard 6 depicts multiple social work services, including the micro, meso, and the macro level, that may be offered to or done on behalf of family caregivers of older adults. As we begin to think about Standard 6, it notes that although care plans may vary based on practitioner role, the scope of practice or setting, they should be developed and revised in collaboration with family caregivers and should focus on caregivers' goals, needs, and strengths. Collaboration is critically important as we begin to examine Standard 6. It really does mean that we really must begin to understand the various organizations and agencies that are involved in the service delivery system. As we think about, again, the strengths of Mrs. Hope, we have to think about how can we assist her in developing a care plan. And there are concerns at the micro, meso, and macro levels. If we begin to think about the daughter in the scenario, if she is bedridden and there is no family protected payee, how is that check being cashed? We must ask the question, should it be possible for a person to be bedridden and not have seen a physician in over 10 years? So a part of the standards help us to stay focused on the holistic view of planning. Now, Mrs. Hope constantly would remind us in the voice of a caregiver that there's a concern sometimes when social workers come in, because sometimes there's a sense that people are minding her business. So the role of social workers working with family caregivers is not to mind the business of the family caregivers, but to support the family caregiver in doing what the caregiver feels best and resonates with ethical practice. I am now moving to Standard 7. Standard 7 emphasizes advocacy. It describes advocacy activities, and I do hope that you will look at these, because sometimes when we do our day-to-day work as social workers, we forget the full range of opportunities that we have. So the thinking and the critical thinking that has gone into developing these standards show you a roadmap of various ways that you can advocate for the family caregiver. This domain of practice includes not only advocacy done on behalf of family caregivers, but also activities done to enhance family caregivers' ability to advocate for themselves. Again, specific examples are listed in the actual standards that I think you will find very helpful as you begin to think about the roles that social workers play in fostering, maintaining, and strengthening partnerships. Some of the ones that particularly I reference you to talks about advocating for family caregivers' integral role in team communication and service planning, delivery, and monitoring. Additionally, it talks about integrating the strengths perspective in program and organizational administration to maximize and sustain human and physical resources. So as we begin to think about Standard 7, it is critical that we pay attention to the full range of services that social workers can offer in the area of advocacy. It talks about the use of multiple media. It talks about education of the public. It talks about the infusion of family caregivers of older adults into the advocacy kind of process. So in discussing this one, I sort of merged some of the discussion with Standard 8, which addresses collaboration, because advocacy and collaboration really do go hand in hand. But when we're working with a family caregiver such as Mrs. Hope, it is important to allow Mrs. Hope's voice to be heard. Mrs. Hope's voice must be heard above the voice of her sons. What about the voice of the daughter who is receiving the care? How do we work to empower Mrs. Hope to help to make the best family care plan? So it becomes critically important that we think about advocacy at both micro and macro levels, and that we include the family caregiver. Mrs. Hope continues to say, I'm 92, but I can still think. I may be frail, but I can still think. So how do we empower her to advocate is the question that's before us. Standard 8, I'm moving on to Standard 8, which talks about collaboration. Standard 8 underscores the importance of interdisciplinary and interorganizational communication for the continuous, well-coordinated service provision. Such communication should focus on family caregivers' contributions, goals, needs, and their strengths. You keep hearing the reoccurring statement about strengths as we're working with family caregivers. It is important in all aspects of social work, but nowhere is it more important than working with family caregivers who are investing their time and need to be understood and appreciated in the process. The standard makes clear that effective collaboration requires strong practitioner identification with one's own profession and the employing organization, combined with an understanding of the roles of other service providers and the roles that other organizations play in service delivery. As we begin to think about family caregivers, we must ask the question, is in the Mrs. Hope stories, how might other organizations be involved in the quality of life and care? How can we involve others in making sure that there's the highest quality of life for the family caregiver as well as the person that they were caring for? As I stated before, it is important that we promote the strengths, contributions, needs, and goals of family caregivers of older adults. It also is important that we articulate and fulfill the missions and functions of our employing organization as we carry out our roles as social workers supporting family caregivers. Slide 9 talks about, the Standard 9 talks about practice evaluation and improvement. Now, I must say this one is very near and dear to me, since at Harvard University School of Social Work, I teach practice and program evaluation. And I'm always saying to students that practice evaluation is vital. We must find a way to evaluate the practice in the field of family caregiving. So Standard 9 emphasizes the need to seek and use feedback from other practitioners and family caregivers about social work practice. Such input, which should focus on both the process evaluation side and the outcome side, ensures that the services meet the goals of family caregivers of older adults. We must take the time out to self-appraise. Is the service that we are providing meeting the need of the family caregiver? We must consult with the family caregiver to receive this feedback. The standards speak about this, and this is so very, very important. The standards describe various methods and activities, including qualitative and quantitative research, that may be useful in improving the practice. As we begin to think about practice evaluation and improvement, we must think about evidence-based practice as being important, because there is a need to better understand various aspects of family caregiving. Although family caregiving has existed since the beginning of time, there are new dimensions of family caregivers. There are changes in the demographic characteristics of families. There are distance caregivers. There are caregivers who, again, as I've said, they are older persons themselves. There are caregivers who are working. There are caregivers who are children, actually. And I mentioned this, and I will mention it a little more, because as we go into the discussion, sometimes the family caregiver may well be a child. And we must think about this and begin to think about how one evaluates the services in these situations. There is much documentation to support the need for evaluations. One of the things I would call your attention to is that there are many aspects of family caregiving that we are not up to speed on. For example, women do the most of the family caregiving in this country as well as globally. Yet, men are a part of the family caregiving system. If you'll recall the story about Mrs. Hope, men were a part of the family caregiving system. Thus, what do we know about working with men? how do we improve the services to men as well? Many research has demonstrated that men have lower stress scores. We must ask that question and answer that question. Why is this? We don't have sufficient research to help us to understand how one person experiencing the same situation has a higher stress burden than others. So it becomes critically important that we pay attention to evaluating the services that we are providing in this particular domain. It's even more important as we begin to think about family caregivers as becoming more and more important, becoming a more and more important domain in delivery of social work services. Very akin to the information on practice evaluation and improvement is Standard 10, documentation. Standard 10 notes the role of documentation and other record keeping in strengthening communication with other service providers and family caregivers of older adults. Effective documentation reflects family caregivers' involvement in all aspects of social work practice. Again, if I were in front of my class at Harvard University, I would say to my students, if it is not in writing, it did not happen. And I know many of you, especially those who are social workers, remember being in those practice and processes classes and the professor saying to you, if it's not in writing, it did not happen. This stands true as we begin to talk about the documentation related to family caregivers. The purpose of documentation is not to supplant, but rather to foster strong working relationships and services with family caregivers. As we begin to think about documentation, it really is very, very closely connected to practice evaluation as well, so that we can begin to even use some of the documentation notes to help us to build a case of what we need to do and what is working well in the areas of family caregiving. It is important to use the caregiver's own words as we begin to talk about documentation. It's not good enough for us to describe it. We need to describe it using some qualitative techniques as well. So when we are presenting what we've done, we understand from the family caregiver how he or she or he was supported by the services that we provided. Standard 11. Standard 11 addresses workload. It is very important that we as social workers and other helping professions think about workload. Workload is important because we can only do our best work if we have the adequate time to do the work. I think this is a particularly important standard for each social worker engaged in family caregiving to pay attention to. Because if the workload is overwhelming, then we are not attending to self-care. Self-care allows us to give the best care for those we are working with and those who we are serving. So when we begin to think about the standards of family caregiving, we must take a macro look at our caseloads and our workloads to make sure that we are providing adequate time for the services that we are delivering. Standard 11 illustrates that each practitioner's workload includes any social work function that addresses the goals and needs of family caregivers of older adults. Consequently, establishing appropriate workloads is the shared responsibility of social workers. It's the shared responsibility of social workers along with their managers and employing organization. It is not a top-down decision-making. Social workers are best positioned to say, this is what I can handle given the complexity of the cases that I'm working with. Without this recognition, we can become what my clients used to say, paper workers rather than social workers. So workload becomes vitally important as we begin to think about how we carry out our responsibilities as social workers with family caregivers. I'm moving toward the last standard, and I know it's sort of like a lot of talking heads here, but I hopefully that you're receiving some information that will support your understanding of the standards as you actually read the documents. The 12th and final standard focuses on the need for ongoing professional development to maintain competence in working with family caregivers of older adults. Again, this is so very critically important because we cannot assume that we're in a static situation. There is constant changing in the field of social work with older persons, so therefore we must focus on making sure that we are paying attention to the NASW Code of Ethics and also the standards for continuing professional education. The standards give an excellent list of ways that you can begin to focus upon this. And I think it's really important for each of us as social workers, regardless of the setting that we work in. It doesn't matter whether we're working in what is known as a traditional aging setting or we're working in a child and family welfare setting. Family caregiving we should be informed about family caregiving regardless of the practice setting that we are engaged in. The next set of information really tells you that we have resources that are available to us. Again, it's an extensive resource list that covers NASW resources that are available, as well as government resources, foundation initiatives, and national nonprofit organization. Being aware of the time that I will move rather quickly, but I do want you to know that one of the things I've done at Howard University with the support of our dean, Dr. Cordell Snell, we have purchased the NASW standards for social work practice with family caregivers of older adults for all of our students, because what we do understand is that every student who is studying to become a social worker will encounter a family caregiver. So it's critically important that we make sure that every social worker is aware of these standards. And so the resources that are there are very, very helpful. Again, in drawing to a close, I would like to acknowledge again the expert panel members who participated in this development of these standards, and their names are listed here, and each of them had a unique contribution, and I am presenting what I had the pleasure and privilege of serving with them to better understand the standards from their perspectives. As I move forward to thinking about the implications and rapidly drawing to a conclusion, that there are implications that I believe are relevant to social work practice with caregivers. It is particularly important to note the cultural and linguistic competency. And I didn't say this earlier when I was talking about cultural and linguistic competency, but we must pay attention and not allow persons to interpret for family members who are not able to do that responsibly. It is important that we respect the dignity of families. As I begin to think about the various implications, we must realize the importance that we have the responsibility to make sure that we are telling the story of the caregivers, not telling our story, but telling the story of the caregivers. So in closing, I would like to mention some research that my colleague, Dr. Sharnetta Gatling Cole at the University of Alabama conducted on caregivers in Kenya. In the Republic of Kenya. I use this because this is a global phenomenon. So although these are NASW standards, I want you to know that they really do have a global perspective. The standards basically help me in the analysis of the data that she prepared. And I want to leave you with some quotes from caregivers that help you to go back and reintegrate what I've said. One, a caregiver in Kenya stated it, "In a day, we sleep only 4 hours, and the remaining 20 we utilize to serve the patients." That begins to tell you something very important. Another caregiver said that we as caregivers, most of us finding ourselves as caregivers, was not of our own liking. We did not start as caregivers, but we found ourselves in a situation that we were taking care of these people because we are caught up in the circumstances with them. Although we help and assist, at times we are stranded on what to do because we are not trained to keep them well and assist them well. But it has become our responsibility to help them. I share these quotations with you because those are the voices of caregivers saying they need the professional assistance that you will provide. Now, what you see in front of you is a picture of my mother, and I am the family caregiver for my mother. You see, I'm up in the corner looking down on the love that she's showing to my brother, because one of the things we know that the family caregiver is very often the recipient of the concerns that the caregiver has. And there's always someone else there as a part of the family system who sometimes seems to get all of the love and the respect. And the family caregiver is feeling undervalued, marginalized, and not appreciated. So you can see I am one of those family caregivers who's desperately in need of a social worker to understand my needs. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Crew. I can see that we have a few questions, and in the time that we have remaining, we'll try to get to as many as we can. I do want to address one question that I saw repeated a few times. I want to assure you that the slides from today's presentation will be made available to you. The webinar itself is being recorded, and that too will also be made available to you. You can visit the Family Caregiver Alliance website at www.caregiver.org, and we will have the information for your use. We do apologize for those that came perhaps a little bit later and were unaware of the technical difficulty that we were having at the beginning of the session. But we thank you for staying with us, and at this point we'll try to get as many of your questions addressed as possible. Dr. Crew, we have one question that asks, how do you see these new standards being used at the agency level in social workers' performance evaluations from year to year?
Thank you very much for the question. I think an important aspect of the standards is that it also reflects the need for organizational change. So how the standards should be used, again, we talked about workload. So they can really help to set up the goals for the particular social workers, so when the evaluative period comes, that they have already been incorporated in the thinking of what the social worker is responsible for doing. As you know, with evaluations, it's important to have the aspects up front and not at the end of the process. But as also, it's really the standards will help to identify some areas that may not be thought about at this point. And I think that's, that's a short answer to I believe they can be used in the evaluative process. But again, I think I would probably say they should be used in the planning process for the evaluation, planning process for the work that is to be done. So once you use them in the planning process, then the evaluation process really relates more to how you were able to achieve this goal and how you were able to measure, and particularly as it relates to documentation.
All right, thank you. We also have a question from Deborah. She asks, how do you see that we can pay for the cost of care given today's for today's clients, considering the constraints we have with the federal laws and their concerns about cutting spending?
Certainly that's an important question, and it's sort of outside of the domain of the standards, with the exception of advocacy. So when we begin to think about identifying what those costs are and who's most burdened by those costs. The standards would say that social workers have a responsibility for advocating with those organizations and agencies at the federal government as we begin to think about how do we make sure that those who are burdened by these costs are able to get some relief for those costs. It is a monumental question, but I would say some of it also starts with making sure that we are collaborating with family members and other organizations so we are maximizing the resources that are available. But I do understand the cost of the care. I understand it, again, on a personal level as well. But what I do know, there's an opportunity for us to educate the public so when there are opportunities for healthcare reform, etc., that includes caregiving, that we can advocate not only when we need the services, but before we need the services. We need to have partners in this so that those persons who are approaching caregiving, as Rosalind Carter said, that you are either a caregiver, you're about to be a caregiver, or you just finished your caregiving responsibility. So one way is to make sure that we have discussions about health care reform, about other reforms, that we keep it up front and center, the growing needs of persons for long-term care and also for caregiving responsibilities, for in-the-home caregiving, and that we advocate effectively for them.
All right. We have a member of our audience who says she works in a healthcare environment and reports to a nurse, which she finds particularly difficult because the social work standards differ so much from perhaps the standards that nurses use. Do you have any suggestions for her?
I do. You know, there's an excellent a journal, American, I think a journal on nursing, and they had a whole edition on family caregiving, and it was a collaboration between nurses and social workers. So I think, and I believe Ms. Kelly was a part of that collaboration as well. So that may well be one of the documents that can be used to bring the two together, seeing that we have a shared, we do have a shared destiny here. So one of the things I would suggest is to talk about what are the shared values. And I do believe nurses and social workers have shared values. But I would start, you know, in social work we say start where the client is. This is a good opportunity to start where the client is. But I really would refer you to that special journal that really focuses on the collaboration between social workers and nursing. Again, I do agree with you. There are some differences, but I think there are probably more similarities if we would have that sort of discussion with them. And I don't want to minimize what you've asked because I know it's not always easy, but that may well be a good starting point.
All right. We have one last question. Certainly want to be respectful of everyone's time. One member of the audience asks, do you feel that a degree is really necessary? This person has an employee who has worked in the field for 30 years but does not have a degree, but she's extremely knowledgeable about assessing needs and coordination of services.
Absolutely, I believe a degree is necessary. As a professor of social work at Howard, I often have persons like that who come into the profession, and they are experienced. They're very valuable, but they are valuable at the area of paraprofessionals. So there's an opportunity for us to work with a person like her. And she could benefit from understanding the standards, but the things that we teach in the classroom, including the theories, the evaluation processes, really does lend itself to a person who has a degree in social work, and these standards are designed for them. But it does not mean that other persons cannot be a part of the family caregiving support system. So I think there's a place for that person, and I commend her knowledge, and because I know that she's fantastic. But the standards were written with social workers in mind, but social workers also work with paraprofessionals in the carrying out of their work. But these standards specifically focus on social workers.
All right, thank you. Our time today is coming to a close. I want to thank you for your questions. And for those that we didn't get a chance to respond to today, we will be posting the responses to them. They'll be available to you at our website. If you'd like to be notified directly about any other upcoming webinars, training events, policies, or program practice, please visit the website www.caregiver.org and subscribe to our Policy Digest and Technical Assistance newsletters. Please remember to complete the brief evaluation form at the end of the webinar today, and because it'll help us in planning for future sessions. We'll make sure that all the information from today is available to you shortly, and we'd like to thank all of you for joining us and staying with us, and also to Dr. Crew for her wonderful presentation.